So I'm looking around, I'm in this empty hospital room. I'm hooked up to all these machines and heart monitors. I wasn't happy I was still alive. I was disappointed that I was still alive. And God just came in that room that day and just surrounded me with love, and I started getting these feelings of peace. And for the first time in a really long time, I started getting these feelings of hope a little bit. My name is Trish Gionet. I'm 35. I grew up right on the north side of Fredericton. My mom tried with the best of her ability to give us a good home, but we moved around a lot. It was very dysfunctional at the time. My second stepdad started molesting me at the age of 12. I had just turned 12. And that went on for a long time. And I was just, starting to become a teenager. I was already struggling in my life. When I was about 15 years old, I was going to church, and I started getting really into it. I started, doing Sunday school and youth, doing worship and everything. And I was on fire for God. I wanted to follow God. I wanted to do His will in my life. But it got to a really difficult point because my stepfather was also a member of the same church. One Sunday night, after watching my stepfather, be so respected in that church and praying, and he was full of the Holy Spirit, and he comes home and he abuses me again. So at that point in time, I left the church, and I basically left my relationship with God. I eventually graduated from high school. I met my husband. We were together for a couple years. We got married. We eventually had our son, but because I'd always seen toxic relationships, because I had always struggled with this depression, because I'd never dealt with any of my issues, including all the abuse that I'd taken over the years, my marriage quickly crumbled. My son was about 1 year old when I was living with my mom, and I was in a really bad car accident. Because of a head injury that I sustained during the car accident, I got some major PTSD problems from that accident. Things got really, really hard. I was depressed all the time, and I didn't want to live. I started having flashbacks of my stepdad, and I didn't know how to deal with them. So I tried to take my life. I took enough pills to kill myself. They took me to the hospital. The next day I got out of the hospital, I sliced my wrist. They let me out again. The next day I tried to take my life again, 3 times in 3 days. I ended up being in the hospital for about a month. And during that time, my pastor in Fredericton came to see me, and I started getting weekend passes. I started going back to church. I knew that there was peace in having a relationship with God, but even at that point in time, I still wasn't ready to give control to Him of my life or how I was living my life. And then one day, everything just got dark again. I was back in the hospital, and I signed myself out. I walked downtown in Fredericton and jumped off the bridge. God kept me alive for another day. He must have a purpose for me. There must be something better than this. So I was living in Fredericton. I was working. I was doing drugs a little bit at this point in time. I met a guy who was from Perth Andover. He was down there. We eventually got together, moved to Perth. We had a house. We eventually had 3 children, and we're raising our kids. At the same time, we were making, horrible life choices, selling drugs, dealing drugs, being involved in a lot of illegal activity. Eventually, after moving around a lot and struggling with, our lifestyle choices, he ended up going to jail. And then I lost my children a couple days later. I had visits at this point, and I was seeing them a couple days a week. And I was trying so hard to get them back. And after trying to keep my head above water and, trying to prove that I was a good mom for social workers and go to my visits and things, I just couldn't do it anymore because I didn't know how to do it anymore. And one bad day turned out to be, a day that changed my life for a really long time. I was still selling pills at this point a little bit. And one of my clients came in one day and I was really, really upset and I was crying. And I was gonna, just do a pill because I wanted it to make me feel better. And I was crying so hard that I couldn't snort it. So I looked at her and asked her to teach me how to shoot it up. I was hooked from the first time I did it. Drugs were my new love at that point in time. I didn't know anything else. It was an everyday thing. Eventually I started missing visits with my kids when he was my fiance, when he had gotten out of jail. He eventually got on the drugs with me. And it was just a whirlwind of events after that. We moved around a lot, we were evicted a lot. At this point I was stealing to cover my habit, and then I just got it in my head that my kids were better off without me. I chose drugs over my children. That's really hard to say out loud. After a couple years of fighting with the courts, I eventually lost guardianship of my children. All rights. And I haven't seen them in 3 years. I could barely take care of myself. I ended up getting infections so bad from shooting up that I had to have surgery on my arm. And then I had an infection so bad in my hand that I almost lost my hand. And at that point, I still wasn't ready to admit that I had a problem. And when I was in the hospital for a month, I still used drugs. I just used my IV, because at that point I realized I was a junkie and I needed it. The next 3 years of my life were, they're still a blur. I had no morals at that point. I didn't care. I didn't care about anybody but myself. And I didn't feel anything. I didn't have to think about all the things I was missing out on. I didn't have to think about how much I missed my kids because I could be high that day. And it was a distraction from everything. Okay. Eventually, I got sick of that. I got sick of not feeling anything. I got sick of being the crappy junkie that lived outside of Plaster Rock. I got sick of being that person. I never liked those people, and I'd become that person. So I made a phone call to Harvest House, and I talked to Aaron. He came out and picked me up that day. And for the first time in 3 years, I was able to admit that I had a problem, and I needed help. And he didn't judge me, he didn't condemn me. He told me that God still loved me anyways, and told me that if I wanted to, I could get through it. At the time I was on house arrest, but Harvest House did invite me to go on a camping trip in Mount Carlton with a church that they had teamed up with, Perth Andover Baptist Church. I decided I would go. I was breaking the law again, but I thought, it was for a good cause, so I'll go. It was my first weekend in 3 years that I did not abuse my prescription medication. And it was the first weekend in 3 years that I had fun. That I got to enjoy my time with all these people that were there, and they were having fun. And they weren't drinking, they weren't doing drugs, they were just enjoying each other's company and enjoying the presence of God. There was one evening there, I think it was our second evening, I went down by the water and I just prayed to God. I'm like, if you have a better purpose for my life, I need to see it. I want this back. I want to do this again. Made the choice to get baptized the next day, and I went back home completely on fire for God, and I was going to change things and I was going to fix things, but I didn't know how to do it. So within a couple days I was back in my old habits, and then I started listening to those lies in my head again. Well, after a couple weeks of those lies, I finally listened. So I took all my prescription meds, antidepressants, sleeping pills, everything out of my house. And I took them all, and then I shot up about a week's worth of hydromorph, which was enough to kill probably 2 people. And it was just by chance that a friend of mine had come out to check on me that day, called an ambulance, and I don't really remember much after that. I remember getting in an ambulance, and then I remember waking up in the Edmundston Hospital. And I wasn't happy I was still alive. I was disappointed that I was still alive. And God just came in that room that day and just surrounded me with love, and I started getting these feelings of peace. And for the first time in a really long time, I started getting these feelings of hope a little bit. I left the hospital later that day. I went into Harvest House in Plaster Rock. I looked at the director, I looked at Aaron, and I said, okay, I'm ready. He suggested, after a long conversation, that I go to Naomi and Ruth, which was a 9-month faith-based Christian recovery in Shediac, New Brunswick. My mom picked me up on a Friday morning. It was October 7th. It was Thanksgiving weekend. I'll always remember it. And that was the last day that I did drugs. I quit cold turkey. The first couple months at the rehab were really difficult. And then I started finding, some of my underlying issues. I started doing really well. I eventually got to start working there a little bit, volunteering. And by the time I graduated, July 8th, 2017, I was offered a full-time job there. In my time at Naomi Ruth, I finished my probation, and actually my probation officer in Moncton told me that she was so impressed. She had never seen someone come so far in such a short amount of time. God started putting it on my heart, you should go back to Plaster Rock. And I didn't think I was ever going to go back to Plaster Rock because I had burnt so many bridges there, I'd been in trouble so much there. And then when Aaron approached me about, starting a women's program there. Now I'm the director of housing. I get to help women there. I get to go see people that I used to use with, and some of them are doing good now, some of them not so much. I get to shine some light and shine some hope in their lives that, their change is possible and sobriety is possible, and I did that all because of my relationship with God. I just want to give hope to parents out there that, there is hope for their kids that are struggling with addiction, or any family members for that matter. And, almost 2 years sober, and life is still good. I've had to deal with a lot of issues. I had to forgive a lot of people. I had to forgive myself. I know that every day God wakes me up is just another day that I get to live for Him. So now I work at Harvest House in Plaster Rock. When I went, I went in those doors as an addict. And now I get to go in those doors every day as an employee, as someone who helps other people. And I run a program for women, and it's awesome. I get to be right back where I started. I still have struggles. One of them is, missing my children. I miss them all the time, like every day. But I know that everything that happened was for the best. I know that I wasn't a good mom at times. I tried, but I didn't know how to be. Picking my lifestyle or picking drugs over trying to get better, it wasn't because I didn't love my children, it was just because I didn't know any better, and I thought they were better off without me. But when I do see my kids again, I know that they'll get the best version of their mom possible, because God has transformed my life into this person that I'm proud to be now, and hopefully someday they'll be proud of me too. So there's always hope, even in the darkest of stories, even in the worst of drug addictions, even when it looks like there's nothing in front of you, or you have no place to go and you don't know where to turn next, there's always hope.